Hi, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you are around the world. Thank you for attending the CyberProof webinar, How to Reverse Cybersecurity's Self-Inflicted Staffing Shortage. Before we get going, I'd like to just cover a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, if you have any questions, you can type them in at any time. So please use the Ask a Question tab located under the player you see there. Your question, we hope, will be addressed during the Q&A session towards the end of the seminar. We also have a number of additional resources that you can check out, including the report that Jeff Pollard, our guest speaker, published recently. So that's in the Attachments tab below the player, so you can download any items there at any time. At the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session, as I said, and please take a moment to rate this presentation. Any feedback will, of course, be valuable for us for future webinars. And of course, this webinar is recorded, and you'll be able to view it on demand anytime using the same URL, and of course, share it with your colleagues. So just wanted to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. So basically, we're going to be covering a range of issues that relate to real and unreal issues around staffing, how they can be addressed through tactics and policies. And we'll also talk a little bit about some of the technologies that can also be used to help us with this challenge. So this is mainly what we're going to be covering in the presentation. I just wanted to, in case any of you don't know, haven't heard about CyberProof, we're a security services company. Essentially, we're in the managed detection and response segment of security services. One of our key components is someone we call CIMO, which is a virtual analyst that helps us automate and accelerate cyber operations. Of course, CIMO works together with our experts and analysts that help companies manage their security posture. We're a growing company. We were established in 2017. We have a wide portfolio of security services and consulting capabilities. We have been very active in mainly the financial services, insurance and retail business. And we are owned by a large US-based IT company called UST Global. And we have, basically as a managed service provider, we have security operations in most of the continents that allows us to provide a global footprint. So both in the Far East, in India, in Tel Aviv, London, and in Orange County on the west coast of the US. So what I'd like to do is essentially introduce you to our guest speaker, Jeff Pollard. He is a Forrester VP Principal Analyst, and he covers the cybersecurity market. So Jeff, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Howard. And thanks everyone for being here this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Really excited to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorite research projects that I was able to do with a couple of my colleagues, Joseph Blankenship and Chase Cunningham, this year. And it was pretty exciting to kind of work through. The inspiration for this really started to dig into whether or not there is a staffing shortage within the cybersecurity industry, and also explore what's causing it or what factors into it was really where we started. And we definitely came away from the research with definite opinions about whether or not it exists and kind of what's causing it, which we'll drill into today. So excited to kind of dig into the topic. I want to start things off with some common myths out there. And this might give you a sense, of course, for where some of the webinar is going to go as a little bit of a spoiler. But there are some common myths that we all encounter in our lives, and most of us just kind of accept them because they're true, because we've always heard it. One of my favorites is the myth that it takes 7 years for gum to digest in your stomach. So if you're chewing gum, it takes 7 years before that's digested, right? So your parents might have always told you don't chew gum, or if you chew gum, don't swallow it. It takes 7 years. Not true. Not true. It's digested just like anything else. And we'll skip, sort of the back end of those processes. But it's safe to say that swallowing chewing gum is not really any different than anything else that you might want to do out there. Another interesting myth that persists is that we only use 10% of our brains. Again, not true. That's one of those things that's just kind of out there and talked about as common wisdom or an accepted truth, and there's no proof of it. There's no kind of scientific evidence that exists at all. It's just one of those things we've heard and we kind of commonly accept. And in a lot of ways, the cybersecurity staffing shortage has also become one of those things that we just accept now. So the other myth I'll bring up is that we don't have enough people to fill cybersecurity jobs. There's some truth in that. There's definitely some truth in that, but not as much as you might think, and not for the reasons you might think. And for a number of organizations, the way that they experience this is actually the problem. So their perception of the staffing shortage is actually due to a lot of things that they're doing to themselves. And so we really came away from our research regarding the staffing shortage in many ways as a self-inflicted wound. It's something that security leaders and companies and recruiters and HR teams and IT teams, frankly, are doing to themselves a little bit more than the overall shortage itself really affects them. And that was kind of fascinating. And we're going to dig into a lot of those ideas coming up soon. You'll also hear a lot out there about the competitiveness in the market, the fact that salaries are going up, that compensation rates are going up, that it could cost a lot of money. And this is something that isn't a myth. This is definitely true. In fact, this is one of the big problems out there from a staffing shortage perspective, which is that, it's actually true that we're quite in demand right now. And so that does mean that some of the conventional methods for recruiting and compensation and benefits, they don't work like they used to. And that's actually something that challenges a lot of companies. And we'll get into that in a few slides. One of the more common things out there that you'll hear are these kind of millions of number shortages. 2.93 million cybersecurity positions open and unfilled around the world, according to nonprofit IT security organization ISC Squared. You'll see stats like this from recruiting firms, from certification bodies. And, the only thing I would caution you with, of course, is that some of these organizations are in the business of equipping people with certifications, or maybe even performing job hunts for them. And so it's a little bit in their own interest to play up the staffing shortage, right? To really sort of lean into it and make it seem bigger or worse than it is. Not to say that ISC Squared doesn't do some great things for the industry. They certainly do. And CISP is one of those certifications that certainly represents a certain level of capability from a practitioner, of course. And it also indicates some degree of interest and perseverance and dedication to be able to get it. But whenever you see these giant numbers out there and you think about the staffing shortage, consider the bias of the source itself and realize that there's likely an economic incentive for these organizations to perpetuate the concept of the staffing shortage and really make it seem like maybe it's worse than it is. And also, there isn't necessarily a lot of real interest in helping organizations solve this from organizations like this, right? The staffing shortage is the thing that ISC Squared wants to focus on, whereas recruiting and retention are things that companies really should be focused on. And we'll get into that in a few slides as well as we kind of talk through the problem. The ultimate conclusion that we'll kind of start with, and what we really found in our research, is that this staffing shortage is largely self-inflicted. I mentioned that a couple of slides ago, but I really want to stress it. When it comes to talking to the organizations that we talked to, and we interviewed a number of end user organizations, we interviewed a number of vendors about how they're recruiting, we interviewed some of those same certification bodies and other places, we interviewed universities and educational institutions, and what we really came away with is that this is something that's largely self-inflicted, and it is something that if you are experiencing it as a company, it's probably something that you're experiencing due to your own internal processes and your own internal situations, more than it is that there is this entire vacuum out there of people that you just can't find. That can be true in pockets and in certain regions and geographies. That's the case, but across the board, across the sort of globe itself, it really isn't what we see. And there's a number of mechanisms to kind of cope with this that I'll go through. The first is that our expectations of what a cybersecurity professional looks like, what they should do, how they should be compensated, are just entirely out of whack. They just don't make sense. We're doing a lot of things wrong in terms of what we expect from a cybersecurity professional. So as part of our research, one thing we went out there and did is we studied a bunch of job requisitions of various companies out there. And luckily, there were a number of folks on Twitter and people in the InfoSec community that also were kind of ranting about this as part of the same time we were doing this research. And as they found out about it, they would send some of the job links over to us. But some of them were just crazy when you looked at what they were asking for from an entry-level perspective. So some of these roles, right, started the title cybersecurity analyst, salary $48,000. I mean, that's okay, right? And keep in mind, most of this in US dollars, by the way, so if you're around the globe, there's some currency conversion. Entry-level person, the education, a Bachelor of Science or a Master of Science. So we're already, in a situation where we're asking for a 4-year degree or, a 5 or 6-year degree, depending on the master's program that you're in. And the experience required is a minimum of 5 to 7 years. Now, this isn't one job rec. This is multiple job recs that we distilled down. If this was just in one, we wouldn't have included it. This was in multiple job requisitions that we found where they were asking for an entry-level person in a hyper-competitive industry, in a highly skilled industry that wanted a bachelor's or a master's degree, a minimum of 5 to 7 years experience in an entry-level role, and then the compensation is $48,000. That's just insane. If you're experiencing the staffing shortage and you feel like it's hard to find people, and this looks a lot like the job rec that you have out there, that's kind of concerning. And by the way, we saw this in the US, we saw this in Europe, and we saw it in APAC. So the currencies might have differed, but the overall setup of skills and the kinds of things that people were asking for was pretty much the same across the board. And again, if this is how you're sort of filtering candidates, or this is how you're bringing candidates into the organization, it's going to feel like there's a huge staffing shortage. You're going to start to really accept those numbers of, 2.93 million people. One of the other things out there we found is how many lives must you live to fulfill all of these jobs? And something Hayden Johnson posted on Twitter. This was from another entry-level job rec where they wanted you to have IDS, IPS experience, SIM, firewalls, packet analysis inspection, raw security logs. You can read all of the bullets there, right? That's a ton of things. And if you want someone that has experience in all of these things, I mean, this is someone that knows cloud, that knows web apps, that can do documentation and investigation, that knows software and web development, network security. I mean, I'm talking fast for a reason, because if I read all of these at a normal speed, I wouldn't be able to get through them in this webinar. And these compensation rates are the same as the other ones. So we're effectively looking for professionals that can do 12 to 15 different disciplines, to hire someone. And that's a big part of the reason why we can't find people, because when you're asking for someone to do all of these things, you're asking for someone that's been reincarnated and retained all of their old memories. And you got lucky because they might have started in network security and now they're learning app dev in their reincarnated life form, right? It just doesn't make sense. That isn't the way to find people. It's not the way to recruit people and keep talent. What we're really looking at here is the fact that we keep looking for MacGyver, but we're paying like McDonald's. You don't get a hyper capable, sophisticated, solve every problem skill set in a compensation range that is just, completely unrealistic for that. And we just continually saw this out there where organizations were looking for job recs like I just showed you, but then had compensation ranges that weren't realistic at all to get that kind of talent and that kind of resource. And this was one of our favorite lines in the overall report is really the kind of MacGyver versus McDonald's model, because we just saw it perpetuated so many times when organizations would begin to recruit and look for people. So, look for that job rec you have and look at the compensation rates and figure out, are those realistic together? Is someone really going to accept the comp that you have if they have all of those skills? When you consider that the people that you're competing with for this talent, you're competing with other companies in your area. That's true. Because remote is now becoming an option. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You're probably competing with remote opportunities. And guess what? All of the vendors that you use, that you turn to for your products and services, they're also recruiting talent. And so when your compensation requirements are out of whack, you have to realize that you're not just competing against other companies in your area, you're also even competing against some of your most trusted suppliers sometimes for that talent. And in many cases, vendors will compensate individuals better than end user organizations. That's why it's often easier for vendors to retain talent compared to end users. So definitely something to think about. Now, to start thinking about how you can alleviate some of these problems or ultimately sort of overcome the perception, or because perception's reality, the reality of the staffing shortage that you're experiencing because of what you've inflicted on yourself, one of the first things to do is change how you recruit and hire security talent. This is a big one. First of all, when you think about changing how you recruit security talent, one of the things that means for security leaders in particular is you almost have to think about searching for talent and recruiting talent as a sales process. And if you haven't ever been involved in sales before, this can be even more complex, but you have to really think about looking for people and recruiting people as an exercise in lead generation. You have to actively recruit. You have to get out there. You have to participate in the community, and you have to cultivate those jobs. You can't just depend on your HR teams or the recruiters within your HR team or even external recruiters to find people. You've got to go out there and actively do this. You've got to post this on Twitter and LinkedIn. You've got to use your existing employees and have them mine their network. You've got to look inside your own company. But you ultimately can't just open up a requisition, hand it to HR, and then have HR find people. That's just not a good way to do it. You'll still probably find people. It's just going to take you a lot longer. If you want to find people quickly and really have your choice, it's about actively recruiting and actively going out and finding security talent rather than kind of treating this as a passive exercise where you just kind of wait for people to come to you. That's definitely not the way that you want to do it. So think about this as more of a sales process where you're going out and actively recruiting. The other big thing is change your perception of what a security person looks like. The tech industry in recent years has definitely taken a beating because of lack of diversity, a lack of inclusion, a bro culture, if you will, as has been espoused or talked about out there. Security isn't exempt from that. I mean, we're definitely a victim of that in the same way that the tech industry is. So you have to change your perception of what a security person looks like, of what their background is. It may not be, a guy in a hoodie that loves to do pen tests, right? That may not be a security person that you can work with. You ultimately need to think about how these people fit inside your organization and what skill sets you're actually looking for, and make sure that you're overcoming both your conscious biases, which is a huge thing, but also overcome, and this is actually more challenging, the unconscious biases that you have, the things where you might have a perception of what a security person looks like that doesn't match the reality of it, where you're thinking about security 20 years ago in terms of the way that you found people or how people got into the industry, and it doesn't reflect how that might look today. So it's really important to do a little bit of self-assessment here and think about exactly who you are and where you've come from, and then look at some of the outstanding talent you have now, especially your recent hires, and then look at where they came from, and really make sure that you're not sort of reinforcing things that you were already doing that might have put you in the situation of having the staffing shortage anyway. I wrote this report alongside one of my colleagues, Chase Cunningham. Chase is a former Navy and former NSA. Now he's here at Forrester. And, one of the things that we're all especially passionate about is, consider recruiting veterans. But broaden the backgrounds you consider when you're recruiting veterans. One of the things you'll often hear out there is a little bit of what I just described with Chase, right? He's former Navy, and he worked with cyber operators in the Navy and was paired with SEAL teams and things like that. Then he went to the NSA. When Chase transitions out of NSA, for example, and goes into the private sector, he's got a lot of choices because everyone wants a person like him, and he's awesome. And he's got a lot of experience in that, or someone that might have an intel background, right, from the Army or Air Force or something like that. But those aren't the only backgrounds that you can teach security to, right? A lot of people in the military that might have different occupational specialties or the sort of nomenclature depending on the branch you're talking about, they've been in crisis situations. They've been in high stress situations. They've been in process-oriented roles where they had steps to follow. They've achieved some degree of discipline. So think about other roles, not just the intel and not just the computer network defense or the cyber operator roles. Think about folks that might have been involved in explosive ordnance disposal, an incredibly stressful gig, that also has some degree of technology involved. Think about people that did other roles than just the traditional person that can sort of walk out and know cyber, because there's a ton of talent there that is under-recruited because people are overemphasizing the traditional cyber skill sets out of the military. And so even when you think about recruiting veterans, don't just recruit the tried and true occupational specialties. Think about broadening that and bring in people that have a different background that have indicated, again, that they can work with processes and they can work in high-stress situations. It's just the onus is then to teach them security, but they've obviously demonstrated that they have skills that will work well within the industry. Also, recruit internally. This is one that I think a lot of CISOs talk about doing, but I don't think they do it as effectively as they could. One of the old things that I always heard, I started my career doing pen testing and things like that. And one of the things I always heard from folks about pen testers is that when you wanted someone that was really good at kind of living off the land and lateral movement in a Windows environment, sysadmins were phenomenal because they understood how desktops talk to servers and how servers talk to servers. And so there was kind of no one better to laterally move through an environment from a pen test perspective than a former sysadmin, because they know how sysadmins think because they were one. That's true. Your next security pro may come from inside the company. They're just not in security right now. They might have an interest, or they may not even know how their skills might translate. So sysadmins, right? Certainly. Application developers, web app developers, people that have an application background in building apps, do they have an interest in breaking applications? Do you have an app developer inside your company that's great at debugging, for example? Awesome security skill set, right? Debugging is fantastic. That's part of to some degree malware analysis, right? It's kind of figuring out what the code does and what it doesn't do. So there's a lot of skill sets, but you do need to actively recruit internally. And some of the ways to do this are even consider things like job rotations, where maybe someone from the app dev team joins security one day a week for 3 months or something. And then you can evaluate their interest, or maybe someone from the IT or network engineering team, again, job rotates into security. There's a number of different ways to do it, but think about how you can take someone that's doing something now, maybe they're building things, and then, float them over to security where maybe they could be more involved in defending it or hardening it or breaking it, right? They might be great pen testers too. So there's a lot of opportunity there for folks to transition from one role to another where there's a bit of a Venn diagram. And this is also underutilized. It tends to be that those people have to sort of step up and say, I'd like to go to security, as opposed to going and finding those people. And that's also something your teams can help with. If you think about your direct reports or even your sort of frontline security practitioners, if they know people on other teams that are receptive and interested and curious, have them sort of do some of the internal recruiting to bring people over. So definitely an avenue to explore there that a lot of companies often don't make the most of that they should. And then ultimately, especially from an HR perspective, I think one of the really important things to do is really sort of redefine what a good candidate looks like. Think about the fact that it isn't just a bachelor's degree in computer science that you need to have as a signal to to your HR folks that that's what you should look for. In fact, we make an argument, and I'll get to this in a few slides, that you should probably discontinue that altogether because, you know, that's a gate mechanism that probably isn't as relevant. But one of the things that we found as we talked to different folks out there is that there were kind of three things that were really important to identify great security candidates that some organizations had really honed in on as things that they absolutely looked for. And when they found someone with these characteristics, they made an excellent security resource. And the first was intellect, obviously, right? Intelligent, but someone also that's, you know, curious as a part of that intellect, someone that, you know, wants to answer questions, that wants to understand things, that wants to dig into problems. That was huge. That was something that really sort of shined in helping people identify good candidates. And in most cases, that intellect was much more valuable than the education. You know, finding someone with that intellect, that doesn't always manifest itself well in a traditional educational structure, especially a particularly rigid educational structure. Folks with this degree of intellect may not fit in well there. So actually only looking for folks that have been to traditional universities, 4-year programs, and that sort of thing, actually, you know, acts as a barring mechanism that can in many cases exacerbate a staffing shortage. One of the other big things out there was looking at motivation over certifications. So intellect was the first one, motivation was the second one. And motivation is really about, you know, if you take that intellect and you say the person's curious, well, motivation is about them going out and finding the answers, right? Not waiting for it to be delivered to them, not waiting for someone to teach them, but someone that has a passion for a problem and wants to solve that problem was really, really important. And to look at that motivation over certifications, especially because one of the downsides to certifications, especially globally, is that they're an economic barrier for a lot of candidates that might have passion. A lot of certifications are very expensive. Some of them require week-long courses, followed by testing after that. Some companies shared with us that to get an employee certified, it cost them between $6,000 and $10,000 if you factored in travel, learning materials, the cost of the course, and the cost of the test. And that's something that companies have trouble paying for. If you're an individual that wants to break into the industry, that's even more difficult to pay for, right? That's a huge sum, especially in developing parts of the world. So think about that. Consider that certifications often act as a gatekeeping mechanism, but in a really bad way, because it also filters the type of candidates you get to people that could afford to do that in the first place, which is a challenge. So look at people that are motivated, and don't look at the fact that they don't have certifications as an indicator that they aren't motivated. Look at it that they might have some sort of other circumstances that have made it impossible for them to get there. And then finally, fit. So intellect was first, motivation was second, and fit over experience. And fit is really about, you know, do they understand the role of security? Is it something that they're passionate about? And do they fit in to a security role in terms of the behaviors and actions that they have? You know, keep in mind, this isn't about cultural fit, because often cultural fit is almost a signaling mechanism that impedes diversity of all types, not just gender, but also sort of mental and other types of diversity out there. But one of the things about fit is not so much are they a cultural fit, but, you know, are the things that they're passionate about, are the things that they're excited about, do those fit in to security? Do they have sort of a commitment to the mission? Do they want to solve problems? Are they passionate about defending things? Are they passionate about investigating things? So it's more than just that sort of cultural fit, which again is kind of a loaded term. This is more about, do they fit with a security mindset? And then, you know, can they work well inside the organization? You know, are they good at communicating, or does the role that you're trying to put them in force them to communicate more internally or externally? Those are all factors for this, but make sure that you consider that fit over the experience. If you want someone that has 5 years of experience, but you find someone with 2 years and they're an awesome fit, you know, people develop skills over time. So don't be afraid to you know, select someone with those reasons. One of the other huge problems out there are compensation bands. And this is something that a lot of organizations have trouble with. And I'll give you an example. One of the security leaders for a major manufacturer here in the US, they talked about some of their staffing problems with us. And one of the things that this particular CISO mentioned is that security roles at his company are banded to IT roles. But security compensation is much higher when he's trying to get a candidate. So for every candidate that he hires, in fact, he shared something like in the last 18 to 24 months, every candidate that they hired, had an HR exemption. So they were exempted from the traditional bans. The problem for him was that it's a competitive market. He's aware of that. And so every person that he goes to hire, once they find a good candidate, that person's generally interviewing at multiple places. It takes him an additional week or two, in some cases, to actually make the hire because he has to put in the HR exemption. His boss has to sign off on it. HR has to sign off on it. And you're in a situation where every single candidate you interview, including the promising ones, take an extra week before they can be hired because they've linked security to IT because they both sit under the CIO in that particular organization. If you're in that same situation that's slowing you down or it's problematic and it's costing you candidates, you definitely need to lobby to create unique compensation structures for security pros. Banding things to IT roles just isn't effective for security, especially in situations where IT roles now, in some cases, are in less demand than security roles because of things like cloud, because traditional infrastructure roles might not exist in the same way. So if you are in a situation like that one security leader I talked about, and that's actually one of his strategic initiatives for this year, and he hopes to have it manifest next year, is to separate the fact that IT is linked to security because it's just dragging down his hiring processes. So definitely something to consider there if you're in the same situation. You need to make a push to try to separate that. It'll make recruiting and hiring faster and quite a bit easier. Another big one is retaining the existing team that you have. You can recruit because you grow, and that's great to a certain extent, but you can also recruit because you lose people. And so one of the easiest ways to make recruiting easier or to minimize the sort of effect that the staffing shortage has on you is to retain your existing team. So that way, if you have a great team and you have a great culture, that continues for the rest of the company, right? And so when you think about retaining your existing team, there are a number of steps that you can take to ultimately do that. And I'm going to go into a few of these because this is one of the more interesting parts of the research that we were kind of fascinated by, because some companies do an excellent job of this, and then some companies it's a complete afterthought. It was kind of surprising how many organizations looked at employees leaving as just something that had to happen. They looked at it as a natural event, and it is, certainly, of course, right? People leave, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are things you can do to keep people. One of the first things that we heard was allowing your team to shine. Let them do interesting things. Don't necessarily sort of keep them locked into to existing roles. Like, let them experiment, let them build things, let them try things out, give them some time to work on open source projects or implement open source projects, but also make sure that they have a chance to shine in front of the company. If your company gives out awards, make sure that security gets an award too. If you have opportunities for someone besides the highest level security leader to go present to other people in the organization, let some of your security team do that. Use that as a growth exercise. So don't sort of be the only authority figure for security. If you've got team members that are interested and passionate about doing things like building relationships with stakeholders, give them a chance to do it. That's really important. And again, a lot of organizations just don't do that, right? It tends to be that a lot of CISOs tend to think of their security team as kind of, they don't want to talk to other people. And that's true. We've got people like that, don't get me wrong. But that's not everyone, right? That's kind of an issue of biasing the sort of perception of your entire team. And you might actually have people that are really good at this. So let them shine, let them step up. Also, plan for your team's advancement. This was one of the more interesting points out there that a couple of organizations talked about, where they were completely open about their succession planning across the entire security team. In fact, this was a relatively small dedicated team of security pros, and then they used a lot of services to kind of augment what the existing team was doing. But one of the things that was very well mapped out in their organization was the CISO, should that person choose to leave, the person that would get that role, or at least have an inside track on that role. They probably still recruit a little externally, but the person that had an inside track on that role already knows. So the deputy CISO in this organization is already identified, and from a succession planning perspective, it's been communicated that should the CISO leave, that person has sort of inside track on the role. But they also did that further down throughout the organization. In fact, they had done that all the way down through the manager level. So all of the directors and managers that reported to that CISO, the next person in line for those roles was also identified. And it was communicated. Now, of course, those people had to wait, right? Just because you're next in line for the director role, right, doesn't mean you're going to get it. It doesn't mean that director is going to leave. But one thing that it allowed them to do, and by the way, they stuck with this when someone did leave, the person that was next in line, generally got the role if they decided they wanted it. But one of the big things this allowed them to do is that when their candidates, got offers from recruiters or, got those LinkedIn messages or whatever, they were able to look at the role and say, yeah, that's interesting, but it's a lateral move. And if I stick around, I think I'm going to move up. So why would I go for a lateral move? So it actually helped them stop employees from just taking compensation-based raises for lateral promotions or lateral moves, really, because they knew that they were kind of next up if someone left. So it really kind of helped them retain talent. And also, to be honest, and this is something they shared with us, and we didn't put it in a report exactly this way, but the other thing it did is that if you weren't next in line from a succession planning perspective, it meant that you needed to work on something or you needed to develop a skill set or something. There was some issue, and those people left or they improved that skill set and they left gracefully. So sometimes it was also a mechanism for them to be able to say, you're just not quite what we want for that role. So if you're interested in that, it's not going to happen here. Now, we'll try to get you ready for it, but if you find another opportunity or if someone reaches out and they want someone, I'll let them know. But for here, that's not going to be you. And it was a way for them to do it and also sort of, selectively sometimes weed out the folks that may not be a great fit moving forward, which was, super interesting. So there was kind of a dual benefit from a succession planning perspective. Obviously, when you do this, you have to make sure that you respect any HR laws or other compliance issues within the region that you're in. So there is some balance there that you have to consider. But it is an interesting approach as long as you make sure to adhere to any of those sort of external standards. And then one of the other things that folks did that was good was they would rotate employees. So, and this was within the security team. And so one of the things they would do is that they wouldn't let skill sets atrophy, but they also wouldn't let people get bored. So they would rotate employees. So maybe they had someone that was strong with network security skills, or maybe, packet analysis or something like that. They didn't think of that person as just a network person. They would make sure that person got exposure to other technologies. They would make sure that they, were familiar with the SIM. They would make sure that maybe they got some application security experience, et cetera. So they would rotate job roles within the team. Sometimes it was for one day a week. Sometimes it was actually a dedicated assignment for like one quarter where they would rotate someone into another group within security for 3 months. And the big thing there was that it allowed them to make sure that their security people didn't get bored. It let them learn about other things and other technologies. And the other thing it eliminated, and this was a really important point that a few leaders brought up, is it eliminated grass is greener syndrome, right? Where maybe you have someone that knows network really well and knows firewall, and they suddenly decide they want to get really good at AppSec. Well, they spend a week or a month over with the AppSec folks and say, whew, GitHub is boring, GitLab is boring, I don't like commits, static analysis is awful, I don't want to fix bugs, turns out I hate Python, whatever it is, right? And suddenly they sort of have a better idea of how good they have it, right? Because, what's the saying about the grass is greener? It generally means there's better fertilizer over there, and we all know what fertilizer consists of, so you have to be a little careful. But by doing a job rotation, people were able to minimize the effect of this largely. There's other things you can do too to help overcome the staffing shortage, right? Some of these are issues that it could be really hard to overcome. So if HR is banding security to IT salaries, that's tough. That's an organizational problem, and it can be hard to overcome that. That can be like a multi-year sort of initiative. So that's where you can think about technology and vendors and services also to your advantage to help overcome some of the staffing shortages, sort of the effects that you might feel sort of first order. The first is augment humans with technology, right? So one of the things we know, if you think about things like ML and AI, for example, so let's take when you take a great chess player and you take AI that plays against them. A great chess player can be beat by a great AI. We know that. So a human can beat a human, AI can beat a human, and then you can have AI compete against AI. And, which one of those is better will generally win. But what's interesting is when you pair a human with AI and they compete against AI only, the human plus AI wins. It's a decided advantage. So when we think about things like ML and AI, for example, what we're thinking about is how to fuse those two things together to overcome adversaries. So it isn't about replacing humans with ML or AI. It's about augmenting humans with ML or AI. I think Howard mentioned FEMO, for example, with CyberProof, and that's an example of kind of augmenting what they're doing today with some degree of automation. So don't think about technology as a replacement. Think about it as like augmentative, because it definitely is. A couple of other things, get rid of the grunt work. Try to lift your team up above doing tactical activities. That's where automation really excels, right? Going out and grabbing a bunch of artifacts when you have a network event, or grabbing a bunch of artifacts when you have a desktop event, for example. Those are things that are important and consequential, but also automatable. So, get rid of those tactical activities so that way that the security team that you have can focus on the higher order goals, or work with vendors that can automate some of that grunt work so that way the security team that you have can focus on the higher order things. So instead of, them focusing on the lowest level activity, they're actually using their intellect, their motivation, and their fit to figure out, hey, this is the sharpest needle of all the needles out there right now, and we really need to worry about this. So, again, we hear a lot about automation replacing people, and we think that's often one of the worst ways to think about it, because it really should be augmentative, and it should be something that increases your operational efficiency, because that's really where you can get a lot of bang for the buck out of it. So think about it as helping you scale yourself out. And if you can't do it yourself, then think about turning to partners that can do it as well. And then when it comes to AI and machine learning, one other important point is that, again, don't think about replacing all your level ones with it, because that's probably not going to happen. We're just not at the point where that's the case. Instead, think about using ML and AI to guide level ones. If anyone remembers, this is going to be a terrible joke, but I like to use it. If anybody remembers Clippy from like Office 97, turns out Clippy was kind of ahead of its time, right? Because now we're basically all investing in ML and AI that can help guide people to do activities. Well, instead of thinking about replacing all your level ones, think about how you could use ML or AI to actually help them punch above their weight class, to make them better. Instead of thinking about getting rid of them, instead think about how that ML or AI combination together with some automation can actually make that level one with 3 months of experience. Maybe they can turn it into kind of a level 1.75 with something that more resembles closer to 2 years of experience because of that combination of people and technology. So to kind of wrap things up, I think I'll end this with, there is a staffing shortage. Don't get me wrong. Some of these jobs are going to go unfilled, but a lot of organizations, what you're actually feeling as a result of finding it a challenge to find people and talent, is that you're probably self-inflicting some of these wounds on yourself. And so your experience to staffing shortage is actually a lot worse than it has to be. There's definitely some ways to overcome it. With that, I'll turn things back over to Howard.
Great, thanks a lot. Actually, what I'm going to do is there's been a couple of questions. I'm going to actually move on to here. But before we do that, Jeff, you raised some really interesting points. I made some notes here, and one of them is like, make security fun again. Kind of this idea that allowing people to release them from the drudgery of some of the monitoring, some of the tier one activities. And give them, much more, inspiring tasks and learning. Is that your experience of the general trend in terms of the type of people that are going into security jobs?
Yeah, definitely. I think that for the most part. Now, keep in mind, you have folks that are involved in GRC and audit and others, and they may not quite be the tinkerers that folks like in security ops or incident response or even AppSec might be. So you have to think about the role. But yeah, broadly, one of the things we find out there is that giving your team time to experiment, time to learn new technologies is a really good way to keep them motivated. It's a good way to keep their skills sharp and introduce them to new things. And the way that some security leaders have talked about it with us is whenever they think about their team, maybe say adopting an open source technology or letting their team experiment with that, the decision they make is really, is it mission critical? So is this something that the business is absolutely going to rely on? If that's the case, then they might need to do a more formal route. They might need like full enterprise support. So in that scenario, maybe they go to a commercial vendor. But if it's something that's, augmentative or interesting, or just provides some additional context, it's sort of not mission critical, but still important, those are the awesome projects that you can give your time to experiment on and tinker, and then all of a sudden you've just got a happier team across the board. And so I think that's what we've seen a lot of. Is it may not be right for all the mission critical stuff, but for sort of other minor problems or things that are irritants, that's a great opportunity to give your team some time to experiment and tinker, and they're just happier overall when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we see as a security security services provider, is that when we get into situations where we're collaborating with the organization, with the security team that we're working with, that provides a much more dynamic environment where it isn't like an us and them, it's like a we, and then that kind of the line between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 becomes blurred because everyone's working together on different levels of things that can then, as it were, involve the local team and keep them motivated on the interesting stuff. I wanted to also ask you what you've spoken about AI and ML. To what extent do you feel that is ramping up? Is it still in early stages in terms of the cybersecurity market, or do you think that there's still a long way to go? I mean, you mentioned that we have a virtual, we call CIMO a virtual analyst who's kind of part of our team, and there's no doubt you've hit it on the head that CIMO is dealing with enrichment, collecting data, correlating things. How mature is that side of the equation?
Yeah, I think it's one of those interesting things. If you look at kind of ML and AI on a continuum, I think the first place that it had an impact on security, and it's a place that makes sense, it had an impact on detection, right? It was about finding threats, right? Finding evil. That makes sense. That's a totally acceptable use case for that. It makes a lot of sense. In the same way that ML and AI has had an impact on fraud, in the same way, right? When you think about credit card fraud and other things, ML and AI has really helped that industry out. But detection only gets you so far. ML and AI only gets you so far. And so what's next, and where I've seen a lot of organizations that talk about ML and AI pivot now, is really about kind of reducing friction for security. So now transitioning to where ML, AI, and automation, right, kind of a combination of the three, are actually designed to kind of remove some of the friction from security and make operations more efficient. And that's something that's a little bit newer. I think it's probably the last 3 to 6 months, and obviously I'd say that CyberProof with CIMO was probably a bit ahead of others in terms of making that transition. So I think detection was really the first use case. Now it's about efficiency, and that's a great thing, because one of the things about detection is that you can't control the bad guys. They're going to do what they do, and we know that. But one of the things you can control is your own organization. You can control your own ability to, have a solid playbook and test it out, et cetera. So one of the reasons why I like that ML, AI, and automation angle from an internal perspective is that it's completely within our control as a security person, and it can make our organizations better. So that's one thing I'm a big fan of.
Absolutely. When you talk about efficiency, we also see accuracy and speed. So completely agree. One of the points you made earlier about broadening hiring policies is whether it makes sense to hire people who are either offshore or remote. What's your view on that? Do you feel that security teams need to be in the same physical location, or that distributed teams can work just as efficiently?
Yeah, so I'd say first off, consider that I'm a remote person and have been for 9 years, so consider my bias in my answer, because I want to fully disclose that. The world that we live in, the businesses that we operate within, they're distributed. No one's in a single place anymore. And so while I understand the legacy mindset of having everyone somewhere, and I especially understand that from a security operations perspective, or an incident response perspective, where you feel like you need a little bit tighter control over the data and the information, I get it. But the truth is, as long as you keep doing that, then you are leaving candidates that are every bit as capable, you're leaving them on the table, right? You're not going after everyone, because if you accept a remote model, and if you consider expanding to a remote model, it opens up a few benefits for you. One, you're probably going to find people that you wouldn't have otherwise found. We know that. It also means that your compensation structures might actually be easier. If you're in the Bay Area looking for security people, you're paying a lot of money. But if you're looking in, say, Augusta, Georgia, for example, which is, now hosting Cyber Command and other things, those people are less expensive, or other kind of second tier, third tier cities, or even rural areas. So, by expanding out your capabilities to those regions, not only do you get more talent in terms of pipeline, but you also, receive some expense advantages because those employees may not cost as much. So I think we've definitely moved past the model where everyone in security needs to sit in the same place. That's very much kind of a 1970s or 80s mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a possibly also overused term that everything's moving into the cloud. Is that by means of the cloud, everyone can collaborate and communicate together as if they are in the same room. So if you look at our security operations center, we have as I mentioned at the beginning, we have in Tel Aviv, in Singapore, in India, and everyone's kind of, it's as if with today's technology, it's almost as if everybody is in the same room, and that also from our point of view allows us to to scale. I think we're almost at the top of the hour. It's been a really very interesting to get your insights, Jeff. Really appreciate the time. So I think we'll call this a wrap. And to everybody that joined today, thanks for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Any last comments, Jeff, or you're good to go?
Nope, same as you. Thanks everyone for joining, and hope this was useful.
Great. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.